I was handed a sheet by Randy about a second ago, the thought that I would read this out. But I think that to I'll try and do a little improvisation as we go. I think we had talked about dance. You're going to go with that. Okay, so in his write-up, and you're all more than encouraged to read about it, is that length, and it's incredibly enlightening. He is the resident provocateur. And I said, okay, well, what's that about? And you may have noticed during your last couple of days, I've been coming into the workshops, sitting quietly at the back and taking it all in. And so this workshop this afternoon is that refraction, a refractive perspective of what went on in the last couple of days. And I took a look at what refract is all about. And it seems to be very appropriately used words in this reference. I'll just read what the Wikipedia says about it. The rays of light are refracted by the material of the lens. So just to let you know, where's the lens? Remi Kalir. So, without any further ado, because I know there are rain warnings and snow warnings, I'd like to introduce Remi Kalir.
Can everyone hear me okay? Volume's okay? Volume's on? Up. I'm just giving directions to the folks in the back. Is that better? Yeah? Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Remi Kalir. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. And as I begin today, I want to give my heartfelt thanks to the entire Sandy community. It has been a pleasure to spend the last few days with you. I've learned quite a lot. And today's talk is my attempt to make sense of the deep learning around the digital and hybrid media that's happening in the last few days. A lot of our learning and some of the conversations has, of course, occurred here on Twitter. This is my Twitter handle. I've had a chance to share a few resources and thoughts in anticipation of today's talk. And of course, many of us have been sharing thoughts on the Sandy hashtag. I thought I'd begin today by pointing the conversations here out towards other online and network communities that have been having similar kinds of conversations, ones with similar kinds of questions. And so perhaps some of these other conversations look familiar to you, maybe some are new, but as you read this conference and this symposium over the last few days, and you continue to network around our conversations, perhaps some of the connected learning conversations, or the digital pedagogy, digital conversation, or the OER conversation, or the literacy conversation, become important to our ongoing professional network. Now, I mentioned Twitter, and in the lovely introduction that you just heard, it was noted that I was the resident provocateur since Wednesday. And I've been trying to think quite a bit about what that means and the role and responsibility and the qualifications of somebody who is served as a resident provocateur. And as best as I can make of it, here's what happened. I arrived here at the conference, and as I just mentioned, I was told to move around to the various sessions, typically sitting in the back. Many of you, like you saw me, talking in, sitting down, trying to pick up key words and phrases and ideas. And in that respect, I really found myself running around quite a bit and making lots of pathways up and down the escalator and back through the salons over here. And as I kept crisscrossing my route, I began to also develop a bit of a history perspective, trying to separate myself a little bit from the conversation and take a more reflective, or in this case, refractive stance. These are some of my activities over the past few days. And inadvertently, as I was doing all of this, I walked into a session and somebody made a very perceptive observation. I want to share that observation with you and then talk about why it spoke to me. So some folks in the room, like, Colleen worked for others here, and maybe like, Colleen is the principal of Kindergarten Learning Center in America. And yesterday she was speaking with her colleagues about some distance learning programs that specifically support students with autism. And I walked into the session, and the moments that I observed were moments about collaboration and teamwork. And Colleen was describing one of her colleagues, and she said, he asked questions which are really rich, questions, and that's helpful, really rich questions, and that's helpful. Now again, Colleen was not talking about me at all, and I recognize that. However, I'm going to try in this talk today to rise to her standards and shape my comments around this, asking questions that are rich and ideally helpful. So thank you for that prompt. As I mentioned, as I was walking around, I had a group of folks who were helping me out, some curators, and I wanted to make sure to thank, as already been done, all the various folks who are utilizing their feet and their note-taking and their online resources, and not only keeping track of various sessions, but also sharing that information online. And I did a lot of room on that was kind of the second step in trying to synthesize a lot of my thoughts. Taking people's observations, looking at the summaries online. And by the way, these are tremendous open resources for folks. And I would highly recommend that if you have yet to go into certain session summaries, that perhaps you couldn't attend in person, that you do so, that you perhaps download those or save into your own Google Drive and reference these resources. They're just really quite wonderful. And I also relied upon some special curated notes, some of which got sent to me even quite late last night. And again, I just want to thank everyone who gave me insight into the collective activity of everything that occurred here. And so this is the community that has spent time together for the past 3 days. And here at the San Elon Symposium, we've been quite a diverse group. And learned earlier today from Randy that this is an approximation of who's been in the rooms. About 2/3 of folks from public institutions and 1/3 of dependent. 50% of the attendees here in the past 2 days were from DC DL schools. And then amongst all of the attendees, 10% from Alberta, 5% from Saskatchewan, another 5% from Quebec. And almost a majority of folks working in the primary and secondary space, with just a few folks working in the post-secondary space. And looking at the spread of who is here, it's important to celebrate, but I would be remiss if I did not also ask who was in the room with all of us these past 2 days, and who couldn't travel, or who couldn't connect, and who might want to join all of us, whoever this conference together occurs, perhaps a year from now. As I moved amongst all of us these past 2 days, I began to hear a few conversations. The first conversation, the first kind of theme that cut across much of what happened here, was a conversation about supporting students. That spoke loudly, whether people were talking about tools or talking about pedagogy. The second conversation that spoke throughout all of our activities was one around promoting openness and exploring the boundaries and the blended boundaries of open approaches to teaching and learning. And the third conversation that pervaded much of what we did together over the past 2 days was a conversation about fostering community and the various definitions of community, sometimes the conflict or the contested aspects of community, but fundamentally the importance of doing this work and doing it in community with others. And these are the 3 conversations I'd like to summarize and refract back to all of us right now. And we'll begin with that first conversation about supporting students. Some of the resources and some of the comments about students were, of course, made on Twitter. I thought this was a wonderful visual representation about how students can be encouraged through video and great stuff with people being tagged and really interesting presentations of this information. We haven't seen this track it down. It's pretty awesome. We heard some folks like someone I hope I can call out friend, David Trust, who noted his thoughts on the student panel with Michael from yesterday. And the students who commented, it's important for online teachers to create opportunities for students to connect, bringing student voice into our conversations in this space, and then amplifying them out via forums and also networks like Twitter. And thoughts about the future of what students will be learning and how we can best prepare them for that. Are kids going into the workforce with a sense of social justice? We can't forget their human element to all that we do. Now, this commitment to supporting students also emerged in many of the interpersonal conversations that I had with folks. I quickly developed a very fine bond with, again, someone I hope to call a friend, who noted at one point, we must promote equity of access for students generally. We must go back to the basics. And that to me speaks volumes to the importance that supporting students is fundamentally a commitment to equity in all the work that we do as educators. The wonderful gentleman just raised me mentioned at one point, I recognize the value of brick and mortar schools, but I also recognize what is happening when John and Susie are in these online places, recognizing the importance of multiple kinds of learning settings and how that ultimately supports how students engage in their learning. I've also had the honor of learning alongside for the past 2 months a gentleman who works in an area of actually my own research of game-based learning and gamification. And at one point, Avi was talking about gamification and mentioned improved student engagement, that really means intellectual hardening. And I thought that was a rather provocative term when thinking about something like gamification. All of these comments are to me students who again a core commitment to supporting students in whatever work happens in our DL space. Now I saw a really interesting moment of this during a session on Thursday that was organized by the Ottawa Catholic School District. And the slides are a little dark, but that's intentional and important. Here's why. The student on the screen is having a live conversation with the folks in the room. This is part of the live dive session. It was essentially a virtual school trip where the organizers of the session had scheduled a collaborative opportunity with their colleagues back at school and had worked with students who were literally being wheeled around the hallway in the classrooms of their schools, talking with the attendees in the session about different aspects of learning and design. Now, when I saw this live dive, it emphasized the importance of connecting to students when we really care about them. But it also got me thinking that it's not only about connecting with students, but in this particular kind of moment, there's an interesting blurring of boundaries that's happening here, where youth and adult perspectives are blurred together on equal footing, and that rich conversations about learning and design can emerge from these kinds of spaces. But there was an interesting blending about expectations for what matters in a learning assignment, or in the progression through something like a unit, or even an entire year at school. How is that socially negotiated between our students and our educators? There was also an interesting blurring of boundaries here in terms of youth and adult culture, and how technology can be a mediator that blends aspects of that culture together into a broader cultural learning. So as I saw this deep live dive, and as I thought about this broader conversation around supporting students, I've been thinking about a few questions that I hope are helpful for this community to carry forward. The first is, how do you continue to center students and their diverse and divergent voices in conversations about learning? And how does the student really become the center and the driving force of what we do and certainly what we talk about? I also am curious about the question, how does the design of learning activities and learning technologies incorporate students' interests and their needs? When we design a new online module, or we adopt a new learning management system, or we work to create some kind of maker space or fab lab, is that draw on and again center students' interest in their learning needs? I'm also curious how this community will continue to ask, how do students take the lead in creating and ultimately sustaining school culture? The culture of a school is very much grown from the grassroots and is driven by students and their voices and their identities and fundamentally their hopes and their dreams. And rather than impose a school culture on our students, how do our students take the lead in designing and sustaining that culture? How does that show that we truly care for them? These are some of the questions I thought about as I reflected upon this first conversation. On to the second conversation, a conversation about promoting openness, which is a term that is highly contested, often confusing, and here in the last few days, we've seen a directed interpretation on what it might mean to promote openness. So what are people saying about openness or some of the qualities of being a more open educator? Some folks are talking about a challenge that after an event like can be learned and writing this new inspiring wave of ideas and spreading all this excitement, that conversations that have to move to other colleagues. And how do we find open spaces back at our own schools or in our own communities? And how do we open up in those settings the kinds of conversations we've had in this setting? Another interpretation of openness was around the complexity of inquiry. Here is Tracy, if I'm not mistaken, who was reflecting kind of in the moment on a presentation I believe yesterday that Zoe was putting on. She's talking about this openness to the complexity of looking at both the micro and the macro scales. There's a both and tension here, and that perhaps we as educators need to be open to that complexity. Again, this theme of openness pervaded many of my personal conversations with folks. I had the pleasure of meeting for the first time Connie, who does quite a bit of work around open educational resources. And in one of the first sessions, Connie mentioned that OER is really the sharing of content, and that then the new role of the teacher is facilitating knowledge production. And that's fundamentally positioned and also helps to amplify the importance of both open resources and how those are connected to open knowledge practices. Yet another interesting interpretation of open came from Mary, who I've not had a chance to work with a few times over the last 9 months. And Mary was recalling to me one of her current learning experiences. She's actually participating in an online course around design thinking with some of my colleagues from the States. And she remarked to me, kind of offhand, in a very genuine way, it's good to be a learner again. It's really a humbling experience. And I thought, yeah, it is. And isn't it nice when we can all find ourselves in those learning again opportunities, and we can be humbled, knowing that we have deep expertise, but that anybody's expertise always has some kind of boundary. Openness may also simply be an embrace of change. And Jen, who does some brilliant work around music education and art-based education, was commenting upon how she uses both instruments and online resources to support student learning. And she kind of mentioned, kind of just off the cuff, my blog and my homepage changes daily. And I thought to myself, that's brilliant. The openness and the flexibility to the constant changing dynamic of content is just a part of our everyday practice. And isn't that a nice disposition towards a more agile vision of teaching? So these many interpretations of open, this kind of expansive way we might interpret openness, I think can also be grounded in some of the concrete resources and some of the concrete opportunities that some folks have shared here. I found, for example, one resource, and this is from, if I'm not mistaken, from the Rocky View School, is that right? Really a nice way of for educators who are interested in either designing or adopting digital content, understanding aspects of accessibility, of design, and really trying to shape OER so that it really can be accessible for all. And this digital content checklist, which is Creative Commons licensed, was easy to find online, and can certainly be adapted by anybody in this room, is a very concrete way of grounding some of these broader interpretations of what we might mean by open. Beyond discrete resources, there are also, of course, more sustained activities. And I had a chance to just scratch the surface and learn a little bit more about the VOLT program. And it seems to me to be a really interesting model for how educators, driven by interest, can come together and learn about open practices in a highly supported, networked, and very creative way. And I know that there are folks here, again, including Connie, who can speak about this certainly better than I can. But at first glance, I said to myself, wow, if I was really curious about being more invested in the work of open, this might be a more sustainable opportunity that I can easily jump right into. Given some of the critical and almost, let's say, social justice-oriented conversations that have occurred at this conference as well, I think it's also important to be open to perspectives that are contrary to ours. And the resource that I found that perhaps does this in a very provocative way, and really challenges us to look at history and culture and identity in a way that goes far beyond personal biases and blind spots, is the Voices into Action curriculum materials. And if you haven't had a chance to stop by our table, please do so. I think that's in the material, and really I think speaks to a very different interpretation of open that begins to look at traditions of critical education, and again, more social justice-oriented approaches that can really become the foundation for how we choose to design our learning, particularly in the digital world. So as I look at these resources, and I listen to these conversations about promoting openness, here's what I'm asking myself now. What supports cultivate open resources, open practices, and an open learning architecture? And I think the idea of supports and creating the conditions for that work, many people spoke to. As they spoke about that, it reminds me that the work we do has both technical affordances, many of which we love to geek out on, many of which we want to perhaps design ourselves, but that those learning architectures are fundamentally social. And then we must think about these social supports as much as the technical when we begin to design or architect our new learning environments. I'm also asking myself the question, how does shared language, yet divergent meaning, promote open innovation? There's been a lot of conversation here about the fact that many of us are in the DL space, but we're also just in the L space. We really ultimately just care about learning. And we also share many other words in common, like content and community. And yet there are often divergent interpretations of those words, which may in fact help us to spark innovative change that can then of course be shared with others. So how does that happen? I'm also asking myself, how does this field of education that we're all in, that we all call home, how does it lead to the opening of more equitable learning futures? There was an interesting tension, perhaps, thread of conversation yesterday around this very fast-paced rate of change in technology. We can look back 5, 10, 30 years to the computers that we used then, to the devices that we use today, and recognize how quickly technology changes. And yet it seems like the conversation presumes that the field of education is always playing catch-up. And we had a sort of exchange via Twitter about the fact that perhaps rather for a more ethical approach to the work that we do, maybe it's a field of education that should be more to define the terms of more ethical and equitable learning. And I don't know where Tracy is. I believe she has some work with the ministry, but we had a nice exchange around this idea of ethical technology leadership that follows the real needs of the field of education. And being open to that perspective may help to create more equitable learning futures. So the third conversation, and one that I think brought all of us here, and I hope will bring all of you back, and that's on fostering community. Community was different, of course, and as folks shared online, they noted, hey, thanks for coming out. Thanks to those who attended my session on engaging students. Great conversation. Here are my session slides. We're in a nice way of acknowledgement and extending the conversation through resource sharing. And I hope if you were facilitating a session over the last 3 days, maybe you've done something just like this. Shared out your slides, shared out a link to that curated Google Doc, and help continue the conversation that fosters a sense of connectedness. Someone also reflected on this body and body. It's been great to connect. Another great day at Can You Learn. These are very hardworking, talented teachers and partners in learning. And that appreciation for what this professional community needs is important. Recognizing and honoring that this is a meaningful opportunity is important and not to be taken for granted. This sense of fostering community also came through in some of my conversations with folks and some of what I couldn't talk about. Zoe, who has given a variety of presentations here on making and using perspectives in aspects of inquiry, talked about the inquiry in the classroom is being about creating conditions for human-centric education. And nothing more than human-centric education, in my opinion, speaks to the need to foster community. All of the innovation and technical wizardry may take us not very far down the road if a human-centric approach rooted in community is not the foundation upon which that innovation takes root. And my dear friend, and I call him a mentor now, Jeff, mentioned at one point, we must have a social negotiation of the learning contract. And that idea of socially negotiating a shared endeavor speaks to the kind of mutual respect that must kind of, again, serve as a kind of shared language in a kind of community that works together. So what does that look like here? In one of the workshops, which in fact I was able to facilitate and learn quite a bit from, since I was really deep in that space for the afternoon, we were talking about design thinking, and I had folks run through a very rapid design thinking cycle. And it might be a little hard to see in this photograph, but the poster that he held up was a response, a visualization to the question, what are better ways to blend learning across boundaries? And this team's final visualization asks this question at its center: how to make heart connections. And I thought that was so provocative. That as we think about increasing the efficacy around blending learning and the DL work that everyone does, it ultimately came down to a question of heart and heart connections. So how do we do this? How do we make heart connections with our colleagues? But not only that, with, of course, our students and their families and the community that we're all invested in. And we can, of course, share our stories and listen to one another deeply. And as we share our stories, it often becomes more comfortable that we share some of our struggles and those persistent cognitive practice that really give us meaning, but keep us scratching our heads. And ultimately, as we share stories and struggles, we begin to see solutions emerge, or perhaps solutions to questions like, what are better ways to blend learning across boundaries? This is, to me, the social component of the kind of fostered community that keeps folks here moving face to face and sharing so deeply. And of course, there's a technical component. Logging perhaps is part of the backbone. If you have a blog in this room, please raise your hand. There are some brilliant blogs out there. Not quite half of the folks in here. And my hope is that a year from now, if someone asks you that same question, more folks will raise their hand. Blogging becomes a way of creating an online community where one can share their knowledge, receive feedback, kind of present rough draft thinking that then becomes the seeds for greater change. And if you are one of the people who has a blog, I hope that before this keynote is over, you've gotten on Twitter and you just tweet out the URL of your blog and tag it with our conference hashtag, just so that everybody can access your thinking, your perspectives. And when you all do that, you begin to create a network. It's a knowledge network. It's an open network. It has an architecture that perhaps comes via Twitter or WordPress, but wherever it is, it's a networked learning community. And you can create that with each other as you begin to deepen your learning practice. Ultimately, as networks get active, one of the things that I hope to see in many professional learning communities, this and others, is that additional attention is put towards the archives. That we find ways of curating resources that are easily accessible, where our metadata can be easily attached, and where all kinds of newcomers and those old-time experts can easily find information that helps to transform teaching and learning practices. This then is the technological architecture that complements the social that helps to foster community. And when that happens, I believe it then raises again some questions. How does listening to and honoring stories from one another help to foster our learning communities? Ultimately, if we share information about a new technology, it's often a story about a person. And I walked into so many sessions in the last 2 days, whether it was sessions about gamification platforms, or it was sessions about new learning management systems, that ultimately began with stories about people. And it's those stories that help us to foster our learning communities. I'm also curious, how do we shape these new and emerging technologies to cement, rather than to segregate, our learning communities? This is a healthy tension, and yet one that can have, perhaps unfortunately, a bit of a dark side. As new technologies emerge, questions of authorship, questions of safety, questions of identity are always at the surface, as are questions about intellectual property. And yet the expertise in this room and our responsibility as educators, I think, compels us to share how we know that new and emerging technologies can actually cement community and not further fracture community. These are the conversations that were happening over the last 3 days as we gathered here at our symposium. They were conversations about students. They were conversations about openness, and they were conversations about community. And these ultimately are, of course, nodes in a more networked conversation. And a conversation that not only occurs at the individual level, or at the level of an event like this, but it's also reflective of longer-term conversations, as well as efforts to bring these kinds of conversations into a more actionable approach to the design of our learning. In some respects, these conversations reflect core competencies around communication and critical and creative thinking, and these various dimensions of personal and social identity and social responsibility that, again, are very much the root from which much of our work grows. And it's from these conversations and competencies that we can recognize then a shared desire to move forward, and to move forward from conversation and competency, perhaps to to a more shared understanding of empathy, purpose, and action. And I emphasize empathy given the complexity of setting and culture, students and families who we work with every day. The shared purpose of knowing that the work that you're all doing is incredibly hard, but always honorable, and that action ultimately is our calling. And that we move our conversation to this place together. And ultimately, that happens with a few more provocative questions and observations. So I'll begin to leave you with these concluding thoughts, not from me, but from others, as a means of illustrating the importance of growing this network, growing these thoughts, connecting opportunities of empathy, purpose, and action, and moving the work of learning forward. Ultimately, why are we doing the work? And what are the implications for our practices? The question of why, which was mentioned this morning, and is often the foundation for what we do together. That question of why helps to grow and expand our networks of knowledge and our networks of peers just a little bit. From Dave, we know that idea of giving up tools, of actually giving up some of what we might be comfortable with, is an interesting one to consider. It's something we all battle with when it comes to digital literacy as a learner ourselves. And then as a learner, we simply give up the tools or the practices or the dispositions that we take for granted in order to wrestle with new ideas and problems and challenges. And when we do that, our perspectives and our networks grow just a little bit more. They continue to expand and connect us to new people and ideas. And finally, perhaps most provocatively, from Alana, maybe school needs a complete overhaul. I'm just throwing it out there. And perhaps that vision takes us to the furthest edges of our network and our knowledge. Ultimately, a network that should look familiar to everyone in this room. A network that I hope hopes to sustain you as you move forward. Thank you very much.